Yes, the interesting thing about the professionalization of the art scene is that it generated different kinds of professionalism in different sectors of the art market. What was dominant by the late 19th century, by the turn of the 20th century, was a kind of professionalism that I would call liberal bourgeois. It was about the status of the artist, it was about the technical competence of the artist. It was not about specific artistic principles, it was not particularly about innovation. At the end of the 19th century, what came into existence was a social formation, to use a sociological term, called the avant-garde. We now talk about this all the time, but it's really not been thoroughly historicized. I would say, and this is my area of research particularly, that the avant-garde developed what I call an alternative professionalism based on principles of aesthetic innovation. This was the moment of the isms of art history, so there was a plethora of isms that were established, 50 or more isms competing at the time, little magazines supporting them, etc. There was a real matrix of artistic aesthetic contestation underway that defined this grouping called the avant-garde. It was also distinguished by having a separate artistic inheritance, different genealogies of the understanding of art and its history, who was important, what was in the canon, and whatever. And the third was a sense of identity, which came from an ideology of difference, of rupture with the status quo. And so what happens with Cubism is that, well, I should say that this breakaway alternative professionalism of the avant-garde happened in the 1880s in Paris with the group called the Neo-Impressionists. But by the time of Cubism, another generation had picked this up and taken it further. There were two principles that were guiding this, this development. One was the sense of professionalization, coloured in these ways that I've explained with the three principles of it. The other was a sense of otherness, of being able to think otherwise. Sometimes that was political, and it referred to an ideology of making things new. Way back in the 19th century, the English poet Shelley declared that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, that was wishful thinking, but it registered a belief in the importance of artistic imagination, in his case as presented by poets, but we can talk about it in terms of painters as well. There's the visual level, but before I talk about that, there's also the institutional level. Because of the emergence and consolidation of an avant-garde formation, that is to say, a kind of collection of artists, a disposition that emerged over the last decade and a half of the 19th century, because of the existence by, say, 1910, of a body of artists, some 2,000 or 3,000 in Paris alone, who would have seen themselves as avant-garde. It had a reputation, the city, for being the centre for the most up-to-date, innovative painting. And so artists flocked to Paris to learn. They studied at the private art academies called the Académie Libre, who employed artists from across the aesthetic spectrum, from the most academic to the most avant-garde, to teach them. So students would come to Paris, drawn in particular by the reputation that Cubism had by 1912 or so, both gallery Cubism in the work of Picasso and Braque and Juan Gris, and salon Cubism in the work of Jean Metzinger, Albert Glaise, Henri Lefauconnier, Fernand Léger, Robert Delaunay, Sonia Delaunay. There were more of them in that wing of Cubism. People would come to Paris to learn at these Académies Libres and to learn in particular about Cubism. But of course they would bring baggage with them, whether they came from Prague or Stockholm or Berlin or Moscow or St. Petersburg or London. They came from all over Europe, and they came from all over the Western world, and increasingly all over the world. They came to Paris as the fountainhead of this avant-garde and the modernist art that it was making. But they brought their baggage with them. They brought their own interests. And when they sat at the feet of the artists who were teaching them about Cubism, what they heard, what they learnt, was turned into their own terms. When they left Paris, as most of them did, and went back to their home cities, they took this with them and they disseminated what they had learned in their own terms. What you get then is, first of all, Cubism as a lingua franca, a common visual language of painting, but not just of painting, of music, of photography, of film, of poetry, etc., etc. It flourished across the arts in the first third of the 20th century, and yet it was not just one language. It was a lingua franca, if you might say, with many dialects. So at the same time as Cubism was influencing everybody from its fountainhead in Paris, it was also diversifying, it was being disseminated across Europe. So its influence was, as much as anything, to underpin the flourishing of this network of the avant-garde across all of the cities of Europe, indeed the Western world, but also to initiate the dissemination, if you like, the disassembling of the hegemony, of the dominance of Paris across all of these other sites. Visually, what it did was to take the vocabulary that had been developed initially by the gallery cubists, in particular Picasso and Braque, conceits like the combination of different perspective views of an object or a view on one canvas, ways of representing an image so that we could understand at the same time as seeing that it was a figure, how that figure was constructed, ways of reconciling the three dimensions of the view, or the space or the volume in front of them, with the flatness of the canvas. All of these devices which had been developed in gallery cubism to explore and play games with and to pull the rug from under the whole business of pictorial illusionism were used for expressive purposes by the cubists that were orientated towards the salon. Actually, the expressivity had been there in gallery cubism, in particular in Picasso already. If you look at the work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907, it's as expressive as anything that was ever painted by any other cubist. It's kind of sexual violence, its angularities were not just about pictorial illusionism, they were about the character of the sexual encounter and the equivalence, the equation that Picasso wanted to make between an aesthetic encounter and a sexual encounter with 5 naked whores in a brothel. The salon cubists took that expressivity in all sorts of directions that were picked up across the continent. The angularities of the combination of perspective views that was in gallery cubism were made use of to express violence, to express strong emotions of all kinds. The juxtaposition of perspectives of a single figure was used to express the excitement of the juxtaposition of different views of the Eiffel Tower experienced by people in Paris all across the city. So there was a way in which the language of cubism, if you can call it that, or the dialects of cubism, as I was saying, were used for expressive purposes as well as aesthetic purposes. They were about emotions as well as about beauties.